Hello, respected viewers. I've been asked by a loyal viewer to speak about how the United Nations is so ineffective at enforcing international law. Well, why is it ineffectual? Some of this goes back to the foundations, the United Nations, to pathologies that date from then. So it was established in 1945, just before the close of the Second World War, founded in San Francisco. First General Assembly meeting was in London, but then soon after the headquarters was cited at New York City. And the 5 permanent members to the UN Security Council were the Soviet Union, Russia's taken that seat subsequently, France, China, the United Kingdom, and the United States. China was originally the Republic of China. Taiwan is a successor state of that. I don't know how, but that seat was then allotted to the People's Republic of China, which controls like 99% of the territory of China. UN Security Council resolutions are regarded as being international law, and you require a majority of those who are on the UN Security Council, plus there being no vetoes in the permanent members, the 5 permanent members, and other ones are voted on as temporary members for 6 months. Some countries will serve about 20 serve for 6 months, then they go off, then another 20 are elected, and so forth. But as I say, anything can be vetoed by a permanent member. Remember, veto is I forbid in Latin, and so some of the permanent members are the worst offenders. The Soviet Union and subsequently Russia has used its veto the most, then the United States quite a lot, then the UK, France and China not very much. So any attempt to bring those to any of those to book is almost bound to fail. But there was a period of bipolarity in the world, the Cold War, from the inception of the United Nations right through into the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And then the world was unipolar, with the United States being the sole superpower. A period of relative peace, some sort of mopping up, tidying up wars subsequent to the Cold War. But maybe we don't look at them enough, like Rwanda, about 1 million people killed in 100 days. But because it was in a not very wealthy part of the world, and not many journalists risked their neck by going there, perhaps we don't appreciate the full scale of the horror. And the Western world looked far more at, say, the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Even the death toll was much lower over a longer period of time, because it was easy to report. Maybe it's because they were white that the white world, to put it bluntly, paid more attention. Anyway, so the United Nations had authorized a coalition to liberate Kuwait, which had been illegally occupied in Iraq, illegally occupied by Iraq, and that was just before the end of the close war. So the Soviet Union had voted for that, one of their last significant acts on the world stage. But there was the wars when Yugoslavia broke up in Eastern Europe in the early 90s, and the UN had dithered over that. Yugoslavia is now Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Northern Macedonia, those 7. And famously in 1999, various Western countries, NATO countries largely, accused Serbia of large-scale war crimes in Kosovo. It was putting down a rebellion by the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA. Now, I mean, security forces inevitably kill civilians. I know they shouldn't do, often these are honest accidents, but sometimes it's not an honest mistake, it's willful. And I would say that every security force has done that. I know it's wrong and should be punished. But we can't be going to war against countries all the time for this if it's small scale. But supposedly in the case of Yugoslavia, it was a significant scale. It wasn't a few bad apples. It was again and again, and a large scale. Several hundred civilians killed in just a few weeks. So NATO decided to step in to save the Kosovo Albanians, but Russia vetoed that, so there was no UN Security Council resolution. Nevertheless, NATO bombed Yugoslavia until the Yugoslav military agreed to withdraw from Kosovo. So that was held by many to be illegal because it hadn't been authorized by the UN Security Council, nor indeed had Yugoslavia taken any offensive action against any NATO country, hadn't claimed an inch of any NATO member state, hadn't fired a shot at any NATO member state, had not mistreated a citizen of any NATO member state in Yugoslavia. Nevertheless, there's military action. Some people said this set a dangerous precedent. I remember a Chinese friend saying the trouble is the Americans will one day invade China and they'll say they're doing it to protect human rights. But the UN was seen as palsied with regard to Bosnia, too late to step in. Thousands of Muslim men and boys were murdered at Srebrenica because the UN peacekeepers from the Netherlands were withdrawn. A peace deal was worked out, and had dithered over the siege of Sarajevo. When firm action was taken, when Serbian positions were bombarded, they eventually withdrew from the city. Anyway, so subsequently there was a UN Security Council resolution with regard to Bosnia 1244. Then when it came to Afghanistan, the legitimate government of Afghanistan still held the UN seat for Afghanistan. But the Taliban controlled about 90% of the land. It's actually a similar situation today. And so after 9/11, the United States intervened militarily, and there was NATO intervened. Anyway, eventually there was a UN Security Council about that. But Israel's illegally occupied much of Palestine for decades. Perhaps I should have started that since 1967, certainly. And there have been UN Security Council resolutions about that. But when it came to a real firm action, the United States would always veto that. The United States has wielded its veto more on behalf of Israel than it has on behalf of itself. It's quite extraordinary. Israel, a fairly small country, which does relatively little trade with the United States, which has rather few American citizens living there. The 9 million people who are in Israel, only a very small percentage are American citizens. And there are not many American Israelis living in the United States either. Nevertheless, the Zionist lobby, and I use that advisedly, I'm not saying it's the Jewish lobby, wields a disproportionate influence in the United States. Now, Zionism is a legitimate ideology. There's a strong case for the Jewish people having a national home. So I'm not anti-Semitic in the least. No one should be mistreated for being Jewish or being Israeli. No one should be mistreated for being Palestinian, Arab, or Muslim either. So not all Jews are Zionists, and most Zionists are not Jews. Most of them are actually Christian fundamentalists in the United States. But because of this fulsome backing of the United States, Israel can really get away with anything. Large-scale slaughter of Palestinian civilians, and indeed many Arab countries have been horrific, have been even worse. What was I going to say? So what Saddam Hussein was doing to his own people, or in Egypt, hundreds of unarmed protesters shot dead by the regime there, and the world doesn't really want to know. Or the Sri Lankan government deliberately killing many civilians, and the UN not taking firm action. They knew that, Russia or China would veto any action there. So that's why, really. And so then these crimes against humanity in Ukraine committed on a large scale, every single day, persistent massacres of civilians, persistently trapping civilians in besieged cities, and starvation was seen as a permissible tactic a century ago, but it's not anymore. Agreeing to humanitarian corridors, and when the civilians come out to flee, shelling them anyway. And Russia's tried that trick again and again and again. Dozens of clinics and hospitals bombed, and it can't be all cock-ups, and there's got to be conspiracy. It must be willful in some cases. But because of this system, Russia can get away with virtually anything. Obviously you can penalise nations other ways through sanctions, but international law, it's there, but it's just not really upheld if you're a sufficiently mighty nation, which is what's so dispiriting about this. Right, so that's just a very brief précis of why the international community, why the United Nations in particular, is highly ineffectual at doing anything. The International Court of Justice really has no enforcement mechanism. There have been various international military tribunals for crimes in the former Yugoslavia, or in the Far East, or in Europe in the Second World War, or in Rwanda. But it's often only the vanquished who are really brought to book, and that's why it has the appearance of being a victor's justice. All right, thank you so much. Toodaloo.